How do we make sense of World War II? The largest loss of life of any war in the history of civilization. 50 million dead, the world left in ruins. The first thing is to re-examine this word World War II. Where did it come from? Obviously it was in connection with World War I, but as we look back on the war, World War II as we envision it today did not start until December 1941. Prior to that, there had been pre-World War II wars. The Chinese experience in China, the Italians in North Africa and Abyssinia, Russians and the Finns, and the German annexations. A series of border wars started within the European continent. They were not world wars. There were 7 of them, weren't there? There were the blitzkrieg invasions of Poland, of Norway, of Denmark, of Belgium, of Holland, of Luxembourg, and of France. That war ended essentially in June of 1940 with the fall of France. Then we had another war called the Battle of Britain that waged for about 7 months and was interrupted by Hitler's decision to go into the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Still, at that point, we were not in a world war. We were still on the same Euro-Asian landmass. There was a subsidiary war of the British who had defeated the Luftwaffe, and now we're trying to save North Africa by defeating the Italians, getting them out of Libya, and perhaps setting the stage for a way to stop Hitler by going up through Italy. But we still weren't in World War II yet. That concept developed with the attack on Pearl Harbor and the attack on Singapore, December 7th and 8th. At that point, Japan declared war on the United Kingdom and the United States, and Hitler and Mussolini declared war on the United States. And that meant that suddenly there was a wartime axis of Italy, Japan, and Germany, and for the first time a wartime axis of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. And at that point, war spread to every continent, and there would be battles in Asia and Africa. There had been even a shelling on the United States Pacific coast by the Japanese submarine. There had been hot air balloons sent into the Pacific Northwest. It was truly, for the first time in the history of civilization, an intercontinental war. As we look back on World War II, what did it prove? What were the effects of it? Did it solve anything? In the short term, the Allies' goals were all met. Remember, the Allies had said that we want to destroy Japanese militarism, Italian fascism, and National Socialism in Germany. And we want to occupy those countries, we want to democratize those countries, and we want to make them like us, and we want them never to be able to have aggressive military potential again. All of those short-term goals were met. So by the beginning of 1946, Japan, Germany, and Italy were ruined. You couldn't find anybody in any of those countries who said they were a supporter of Tojo, Mussolini, or Hitler. They had democracies in the process of being created, and they were de facto allies of the British and the Americans. If the long-term goal had been in the spirit of the Atlantic Charter to ensure that a nation was in control of its own destiny, that sovereign borders were respected, that a like-minded Council of United Nations pledged constitutional government and free market capitalism would adjudicate disputes without war in the post-war world. That did not happen. While the enlistment of the Soviet Union was necessary to defeat the Wehrmacht, the inclusion of it with the Allies both betrayed our principles, because after all, Joseph Stalin was as much a mass murderer as was Hitler, and more importantly, we had revived a dying communism. 1939, 40, 41, communism was proven not to work. Russian citizens were dissatisfied. 1946, they were buoyant with the exultation that they had defeated Germany, and they now had governments sympathetic to them from the Baltic states to Finland to Eastern Europe. And what would ensue for the next half century was a Cold War that nobody had anticipated. That was a wage of World War II. We still argue about that. Was it necessary to enlist and pay that terrible price by having the Soviet Union on our side, and then to immediately engage in an Asian and European Cold War? The verdict's still out. In the long-term sense, it was a terrible price to pay. How did the six belligerents fare after the war? What were the consequences of their participation in World War II? Let's start with the Germans. Of all the countries that suffered, Nazi Germany lost 5 million civilians and soldiers. That made them the third in the list of casualties and fatalities. They lost almost 600,000 civilians, over 4 million soldiers, the vast majority of them on the Eastern Front. All of their cities were in ruins. They immediately found themselves on the demarcation between East and West, and they were the center of the Cold War with all of the dangers that entailed. They bore an enormous amount of war guilt because as the Allied and Russian armies came into Germany, they discovered the mechanics of the final solution, the industrial death for 6 million Jews and other minorities in Germany. That would be very hard to wipe away. Germany was, in other words, defeated, occupied, humiliated, discredited, shamed. And it ceased to be a member of the family of European nations, at least we thought. On the other hand, something odd happened. Although it lost most of its pre-war acquisitions, if we looked at a map in 1946, Germany had never been smaller.
The division of Germany is agreed upon. Troops of the United States, Britain, and France are to occupy the western portion of the country. The Soviet Union, the eastern portion.
There was no such idea, no concept as Prussia. The word Prussian went the way of Vandal and Byzantine. It became an adjective, just as you're a Vandal, a thief, or Byzantine, that you believe in a bureaucracy, but there is no Byzantine people or no Vandal people. So you're a Prussian, you're authoritarian, but Prussia ceases to exist. 13 million German speakers were ethnically cleansed from the Volga communities in Russia, from Czechoslovakia, from Poland. 2 million of them died walking back to Germany. The great irony, of course, was Hitler wanted living space, Lebensraum, and his war ensured that there would be more Germans in smaller territory than any time in their history. So Germany suffered grievously, but the fact that it was in the Cold War and it was right on the front lines meant that almost immediately this process of making it an ally had geostrategic consequences and importance. And the war crimes trials at Nuremberg mysteriously began to slow down in 1946 and 7 and 8. That is, the sentencing of criminals was delayed. Sentences that were pronounced were abated, some cases commuted. And a lot of the architects of the final solution and the Wehrmacht got off because we did not want to create disunity within this new ally, and we did not want to weaken a common Allied front against the Soviet Union. The second country was Italy. How did Italy fare after the war? Well, Italy was a special case, you see, because it came in late and opportunistic in June 10th when it declared war on a fallen France. Mussolini was always considered unhinged, crazy, but not necessarily evil in the sense of Hitler. Evil, yes, but not diabolically so. There was no final solution. The anti-Jewish legislation as a fascist power was only haphazardly enforced within Italy. And Italy, as I said earlier, had been fought over 2 years from July of 1943 all the way until May of 1945, so it had suffered enormously. The irony also was that the Germans turned on the Italians, and so they shanghaied tens of thousands of Italian workers who were sent to Germany as servile forced labor, and they were treated worse than any other European worker because of the stain of the Germans believed treason. In the case of the occupation troops in the Ionian Islands or the Dodecanese Islands, the Germans actually took their Italian comrades and took them out and shot them, 4,000 after the surrender of Italy. So Italy suffered a great deal, and it lost all of Ethiopia, Somalia, Libya. Its colonial empire was in shambles. It lost its possessions in the Balkans and the Dalmatian coast. It lost its islands, Greek islands in the Aegean, and it was occupied by the Allies. And in worries that it too might become communist, a lot of the post-war reckoning was abated. But mostly there was not a punitive action directed toward Italy because it felt that it was a half-hearted Axis, and that was the only Axis power that voluntarily left the Axis with the with the hanging of Mussolini on a meat hook in Milan. Japan was a special case because Japan was the only of the three that was not occupied. The atomic bombs precluded that need. And Japan, secondly, had an enormous army, unlike Germany and Italy at the end of the war, that was still intact. And Japan, just as Germany was on the front lines of the Cold War, with the growing tensions in Korea and the Chinese Civil War, Americans, whether they liked it or not, they very radically shifted their view of Japan. And although it was occupied by the British and the Americans, the full idea of reparations, atonement, apologies never quite sunk in Japan, partly because there had not been American tanks and artillery and soldiers fighting over every inch of it, Japanese ground as we had in Germany, partly because they'd never suffered the wrath of the Red Army that came in belatedly at the end of the war to steal a few islands in the Kuril and Sakhalin Chain, and partly because they were felt to be a key ally, especially when the war in Korea broke out in 1950. Short term, we allies obtained our goals. Long term, we still struggle with this ambiguity brought on by the inclusion of Russia as an ally and its behavior in the post-war period. As far as the allies go, let's go back to Russia. Russia was the only power to have at one time or another allied itself with all six of the major belligerents. It was the most opportunistic. If the war had broken out because the British had appeased Hitler and the Americans had adopted a position of isolationism, you could much more severely condemn Stalin because he had actively collaborated with Hitler under the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact of 1939. And so Russia had a lot to answer for in one sense. In the other sense, they lost 20 million people, probably 12 to 13 million civilians, 6 to 7 million military. They suffered the most. Their homeland was destroyed. Their industry had all been transferred. And in their way of thinking, this could never happen again. They lost World War I, and they won, but in a sense lost World War II in terms of damage. So in the post-war order, Stalin was intent that the pathways into Russia that Army Group North had used through Eastern Europe and Romania and Hungary for Army Group South, or through Prussia and Poland through Army Group Center, would no longer exist. And so they would have puppet governments in Eastern Europe all the way up to the Berlin Wall.
Here was a new symbol of communist ruthlessness. Overnight, East Berlin became a concentration camp, sealing in the inhabitants of that sector. Barbed wire and cement were the answers to the refugee problem.
That would be the Soviet strategy, that they would never again be invaded by Germany, and they were going to give the United States a two-front war in the Pacific by unleashing Soviet-style communism in Korea, Indochina, and of course China itself. And so in some sense they fared the worst in terms of material and human losses, but geopolitically they came out pretty well, and they inherited a very persuasive propaganda all through the Cold War. We, the Russians, so the Soviets said, are still fighting the war against fascism. We are still the United Nations. However, our wartime allies, the United States and Great Britain, have now flipped. They have joined the fascist powers of Japan, Italy, and Germany, and they're in alliance against the colonial peoples who seek liberation from tyranny as we sought to help them in World War II. It was very powerful propaganda. It was never quite adequately answered by the Allies in the Cold War. As far as Great Britain was the most idealistic and moral. It was the only power of the six that had fought on the first day of the war, September 1st and 2nd of 1939, to the end, the very end, September 2nd of 1945. Britain was there for almost 6 years, and they were the only country to declare war for a principle. Remember, the Soviets declared war because they were invaded. The United States declared war because they were attacked. Britain declared war because the Germans had violated Polish soil. Now, British war aims were to defeat fascism, restore democracy on the European continent, shore up the alliance with the United States, and preserve the British Empire, which itself would evolve into sort of a commonwealth, but a commonwealth firmly in the hands of London. That didn't happen. The louder Mr. Roosevelt and Churchill talked about freedom and equality and social, political, cultural justice, the more anomaly something like India or Kenya or Nigeria became. And so at the conclusion of the war, Britain lost its empire, and with its empire, its global clout and influence. It was exhausted after the war. And then as the world lay in ruins, the United States and Britain were posed to supply the world with everything from cameras to radios to refrigerators to trucks to tractors as it rebuilt. And what did Britain do? It turned inward.
Some rationing still continues in Britain. Everybody gets a fair share of essential foods at prices kept low by subsidies. Homes were built by the government to be rented to those not with the most money, but with the greatest need.
It nationalized its health care, its steel industry, its utilities, its transportation, its coal industries, and was not globally competitive, and then suffered the irony that within 20 years, Japan and Germany that had laid in ruins looked better than Birmingham and Liverpool did at the conclusion of 1970. How about the United States, the last of the six? How did we do after the war? Again, as the case of the Allies in general, our short-term goals were accomplished, our long-term were not. We had this Wilsonian vision that was enhanced, even expanded by Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United Nations. I think we thought it would be something like the individual states that met in the U.S. Congress. They would be democratic, they would be transparent, they would be free. As early as 1946 and 7, we saw that was not going to happen, and the possession of a veto by Joseph Stalin was going to wreck the United Nations, which it did. The idea that Stalin would be persuaded by mellifluous Roosevelt or Truman didn't happen. Joseph Stalin reverted to his pre-war authoritarianism, and we found ourselves in a Cold War where the brief window of disarmament ended with the invasion across the 38th parallel in June of 1950 by North Koreans with Chinese advisors and probably Soviet pilots and radar technicians, etc. We were very bewildered that we'd fought and we'd won, and then we found ourselves in another war with an adversary that would soon be nuclear. There were other effects too, that nobody, not even Churchill, had been more adamant that the war was for freedom and equality and democracy and constitutional governance. And so as we looked inward, we felt that we were hypocritical. Women didn't have full participation in the public life of America. Blacks could not vote in the southern states. And so we went into a tumultuous 3 decades of social and civil unrest. That was a wage of World War II. But there was also a more insidious price to be paid. Because we were so successful, and because we had been undamaged, and we were protected by these 2 vast oceans, and because we were alone poised to supply the world from 1946 to 1970, essentially, the baby boomer generation that was born right at the conclusion of the war, who did not suffer the Great Depression, who did not suffer the hardship of World War II, but did enjoy an expansive economy, somehow figured that the big government of World War II that had organized the economy, the big corporations that had built the bombers and the trucks and the tractors, and the big unions who had all worked, this triad meant that the United States would always be prosperous. In fact, it was based on an anomaly that the world was in shambles. And we bought into that, and we thought our birthright was to be affluent and leisured all during the 70s. And then when the world became very competitive, that model that had been so successful in World War II was no longer viable. And so we had to come to terms with maybe we don't deserve the affluence, or maybe we don't deserve the leisure if we don't work for it, if we're not competitive. And is that model of big government, big unions, and big corporations flexible enough? And that has really affected the baby boom generation, the me generation, the generation that decided they had certain rights to Social Security, certain rights to entitlement, certain rights about leisure. That was all a product of a post-war affluence. It's hard to see how it would ever quite be recaptured again. A couple of other really important questions to deal with in World War II are the legacies of World War II. The first is the revisionism. Now we've been 70 years since the conclusion of hostilities almost, and have the main issues changed any? Have historians said, you know, the more we get new evidence, the ultra-secret, code breaking, a new cable, a new diplomatic dispatch that's been disclosed, are the main contours of World War II in need of revision. Of course, history is always revision. The United States now acknowledges in a way it didn't that women played a vital role in outproducing the world. If we didn't have Rosie the Riveter, we wouldn't have produced 300,000 airplanes. Blacks were not just supply service personnel supplying gas in the Red Ball Express, but they fought very superbly as tankers with George Patton, the Tuskegee Airmen. We're starting to acknowledge the unacknowledged contribution of others. But when you go through the main progression of events in World War II, revisionism hasn't offered us much. A.J.P. Taylor was not able to convince people that Germany felt boxed in and had legitimate grievances enough to go to war. Pat Buchanan has not convinced us that we should have stayed back and let Germany and Russia fight it out. The paleo right have not convinced us that the final solution only became the final solution through the cauldron of war in the Eastern Front. We know, as we knew in 1945, that once the German army set foot into Poland, even before within their politics in Germany, they were killing people and killing Jews. The main narrative, I think, stays the same. What caused the war? American isolationism, British appeasement, Russian collaboration. That empowered Hitler to take risk. He had a less powerful Army, Navy, and Air Force than the combined strength of Britain and France. But because of the conditions I just outlined, the gamble paid off in the Rhineland, paid off in Austria, paid off in Czechoslovakia, and he became powerful even as he was materially weak. At any given point between 1936 and 1939, Britain and France together and alone together could have stopped it. After 1939, the United States could have stopped it. After 1941, it would require the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain. France was out of the picture. So that has not changed. What won the war? I think we're still back to the same general explanations that we've all entertained the last 7 decades. The war was won by Soviet blood and sacrifice in destroying the Wehrmacht on the Russian front. That sacrifice of 20 million people apparently was necessary for the Germans to lose almost 4 million combatants. It was won by American know-how, material, efficiency, and flexibility. Only the Americans fought in the strategic bombing sphere, below the surface with a submarine campaign, with an enormous fleet, with Lend-Lease, in North Africa, in Sicily, in Normandy, all through the Pacific, and in a strategic bombing campaign against Japan. Not Britain, not Russia, did all of those together. And no one produced more rifles, pistols, grenades, shells, tanks, planes than the United States did.
Inside of 24 hours, a squadron of tanks can roll off the assembly line, and a flight of bombers can be made ready from radio to rudder boat. In one day, one plant unit can turn out enough rifles to equip a battalion of infantry, the men who, in one day, might win a war.
In aggregate, it outproduced all 3 Axis powers put together. In the case of airplanes, both Russia and Britain put together. So that explanation has not changed about what won the war. There were some others that people had offered over the last 70 years, and they too seem to be just as sound as they were when they were first established. That is, the Axis, for all their talk about shared ideology, as all dictators did not trust each other. They were suspicious of each other, just as they were suspicious of their own populations. And the result was Russia was to be appeased by Germany right when Japan was fighting it, and Japan was to be appeased by Russia right when Germany was fighting it. When Germany had a project, whether it was to go into Russia or it was to wage a campaign against France, Italy on its own invaded France or invaded Egypt or invaded the Balkans or invaded Greece, and that meant that the Germans usually had to bail it out without warning and with some injury to its own preconceived strategic operations. In contrast, how could you have a more diverse agenda than wanting to save the British Empire, make the world safe for democracy, and spread communism? That's what the Allies were dealt with, and Hitler himself said they'll never get along. It's too diverse a coalition. And yet, when they attacked Russia, they attacked simultaneously. When the Russians were fighting on the Eastern Front, the Americans were drawing off Russians by intent in Italy in North Africa, and especially over the air and then through Normandy. And the British and the Americans divided up very carefully the Pacific theater. There were a couple of other reasons that explain why the Allies won that I don't think have changed. One is that the Allies had a better, let's face it, a propaganda. Their propaganda was, we didn't start this war.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war.
Not one of us has attacked in an offensive manner another nation. Russia, we would have been at peace if we had not been attacked on June 22nd, 1941. In America, we did not want to go in this war. We did not enter until we were attacked on December 7th, and Hitler declared war on us on December 11th. That was a very persuasive propaganda. The German propaganda was simply, we're racially superior to you. If you entrust your futures to us, we will organize Europe and Japan and the Mediterranean on a system that, if you happen to look like us and you share our same racial affinities, it will be beneficial to you in the long term. And the irony was, think about it for a second. People in the Mediterranean wanted to join Americans, even Russians, more than they wanted to join a Mediterranean people like the Italians. Continental Europeans distrusted continental Germany more than they did distant America or an island Britain. And so we had a much more effective propaganda, and that created a much higher degree of morale. Our soldiers wanted to fight for us, and by 1942 and 3, there were many Axis soldiers, especially in Germany, who no longer believed in Hitler. Another reason, of course, was that there was an irony. Really, the only chance that the Axis had to defeat us was to out-supply us, out-build us, out-conscript us. And the problem with them wasn't that they didn't have enough territory or manpower or resources. Because, as I said, by July 1942, from the Atlantic Ocean to Moscow and from the northern part of Norway, the Sahara Desert, in terms of people and oil and coal, it was much greater than the United States or Britain. And the same was true of the Manchurian territory to Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal to the Aleutians. The problem was not that they didn't have the potential, but they didn't have the know-how and the ability to marshal forces like the United States, Russia, and Britain did. Now, of course, we were harmonious peoples, and we were within one nation, and they were occupying others, but they were never able to occupy territory and enlist people to their cause. A final reason the Allies won is, let's face it, although their generals were not necessarily better, surely Mark Clark, Omar Bradley, General Friedenau, Leslie McNair, even Douglas MacArthur were not of the caliber of Van Manstein or Rommel or Guderian or Model or perhaps General Yamashita or General Hama. But at the next level, the George Marshall level, the Admiral King level, the Hap Arnold level, the Allenbrook level, we had wonderful chiefs of staff. They were not ideologues. They were not yes men like Alfred Jodl or Halder or Keitel, or even Yamamoto, let's face it. And at the highest level of leadership, the supreme command, Churchill knew something about war. He had fought in the trenches. He was a very learned, classically educated, brilliant man. Roosevelt had been Secretary of the Navy. He was a seasoned politician. He was a natural deal maker. Joseph Stalin, for all of his evil, understood finally that he couldn't order people to stay put and be overwhelmed and not surrender and not withdraw and have them shot. He stopped that by 1942. In contrast, Hitler got worse. The more he went into Russia, the more he forbade even a tactical retreat, the more he relieved people like von Rundstedt and Loeb and Bach and all of his best generals. And finally, he was living in a complete world of fantasy that one German soldier, because of his mythical Aryan heritage, was worth 5 Russian Untermenschen, which is preposterous. So at the very citadels of power, the Allies in Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt had much superb thinking, strategic know-how, tactical, operational skills than did Mussolini, Tojo, or Hitler. That has not changed. And finally, we flirt with the idea that Versailles Treaty was too harsh and caused World War II. But the treaty that ended World War II must have been magnanimous because we haven't had a World War III, and the opposite, of course, is true. If you compare the settlement that we imposed on Japan and Italy and Germany with what we imposed in the Versailles Treaty, it was 10 times harsher.
This is the news that electrified the world. Unconditional surrender with no soft terms. It seems hard for the Nazi Jodl, and it was, to admit his country's guilt and plead for mercy.
World War II, we went in, we destroyed their country, we stripped them of all of their acquisitions, we occupied them, we forced them to mimic our systems of government and culture, and we've had peace ever since. So the great assessments of World War II, how it started, how it was conducted, and how it ended, have pretty much remained the same in the last 70 years.
We're celebrating the end of the most terrible war the world had ever seen. The English people and their American allies could relax again after the relentless hammering that their fascist enemies had given them.